By the early 1960s, Jack Kirby was already a name synonymous with superhero comics, as he and writer Joe Simon had created the patriotic superhero Captain America in 1941. As you can imagine, Cap became an overnight sensation following the release of his first issue, and put Marvel, then Timely Comics, on the map in the superhero genre. After creating the character though, Kirby would actually leave Marvel the following year, working for DC Comics, then known as National Comics Publication, before serving in the Second World War. After the war, Kirby would work freelance for a number of different companies, with his most notable creations at this time being the Challengers of the Unknown for DC, as well as the Fighting American character, who he and Joe Simon created after Marvel relaunched Captain America in 1954. Kirby returned to Timely, now Marvel Comics, in 1958, where he worked alongside Stan Lee to revitalise the company's lineup of superheroes, serving as an artist and co-creator for such characters and titles as the Fantastic Four, Iron Man, X-Men, Hulk, and the Avengers. This period of Marvel is often seen as the birth of the company's modern universe, and it was Kirby's larger-than-life art style combined with Lee's witty dialogue that made their book so captivating and popular with readers. However, in the latter years of the 1960s, tensions between Kirby and Marvel began to grow, and while there are a number of different factors that informed his decision to quit the company, many point to the launch of the Silver Surfer comic book in 1968 as a major turning point in Kirby's career. You see, while Kirby had created the character in 1966's Fantastic Four issue 48 and receiving sole credit for doing so, Lee had been pushing for a solo series to be greenlit that he would write, with John Buscema serving as the artist. Understandably, this snub only heightened Kirby's existing frustrations at the time, with the artist believing that he rarely received the credit he deserved for his contributions, and that Marvel were attempting to distance him from all of the different characters that he created. As Kirby would go on to explain in a 1971 interview,
"At DC, I am given the privilege of being associated with my own ideas. If I did come up with an idea at Marvel, they'd take it away from me, and I lost all association with it. I was never given credit for the writing which I did. Most of the writing at Marvel is done by the artist from the script."
While Kirby's frustrations with Marvel grew, it would be editorial changes at DC that would truly set the wheels in motion for the King of Comics to arrive. In 1967, Carmine Infantino was appointed editorial director of DC Comics, and upon taking on this role, he made it his mission to convince Jack Kirby to switch sides. The stars would align 2 years later, when the pair met in Los Angeles, and upon Kirby's acknowledgement of the tensions within Marvel and some of the ideas he had for future stories, Infantino quickly drew up a contract, one that would pay him considerably more than he was currently earning. It's worth noting that Kirby at this time was actually working at Marvel without a formal contract, as negotiations between himself and Martin Goodman had stagnated. With no better offer coming from Marvel throughout the rest of the year, Kirby would inform Stan Lee of his decision to leave in March of 1970. According to Mark Evanier, Kirby's former assistant and later biographer, the artist made a series of demands upon his arrival at DC. As he states in his book, Kirby, King of Comics,
seeking to avoid another situation like he had with Stan Lee, Jack set a condition. He would work with a writer who would provide a full script, all the plots, all the words up front, or he'd write the script himself. What he would not do is plot and draw a comic for someone else to dialogue.
With these terms outlined, Kirby began working on Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, using the title as a vehicle to plant the seeds for a grand epic vision that he had conceived years earlier, the Fourth World, introducing characters such as Darkseid in Jimmy Olsen issue 134. Before launching 3 brand new titles in 1971, The New Gods, Forever People, and Mr. Miracle. While The New Gods was an epic Shakespearean opera, and Forever People was a Vietnam-inspired book that featured idealistic teen gods, Mr. Miracle was notably far more grounded and human, heavily inspired by Kirby's own feelings and experiences at this time. As Evanier notes,
lastly, there was Mr. Miracle, the super escape artist who was inspired by a previous career of Jim Steranko, a new generation comics creator who'd become a Kirby friend and champion. But it was also inspired by Jack's own feelings of confinement in his own career, and his eternal grasping for some way of breaking free.
The last of the 3 Fourth World books to be released, Mr. Miracle Issue 1 came out in April 1971 and introduced readers to the character of Scott Free, the son of Highfather, ruler of New Genesis, who was raised on Apokolips by Darkseid. After a childhood of torment and abuse, Scott and his future wife Big Barda would flee Apokolips and take refuge on Earth, with Scott adopting the moniker of a master escape artist named Mr. Miracle. The parallels between Scott's fear of confinement and entrapment clearly mirrored Kirby's own experiences with his career at this time, as did some of the supporting characters that would be featured throughout this book. Namely, the character of Funky Flashman, an entrepreneur who often attempts to steal money from Mr. Miracle, was a thinly veiled satire of Stan Lee, while his right-hand man, House Roy, was a parody of Lee's successor as Marvel Editor-in-Chief, Roy Thomas. Now, despite the Fourth World books being the ultimate passion project for Kirby, the response from readers proved somewhat underwhelming, with many finding the comics incredibly high concept and difficult to read at times. As a result, it was decided that both The New Gods and Forever People would be cancelled by DC following the release of their 11th issues, while Mr. Miracle soldiered on until issue 18. Considering Kirby's move to DC was all built around this grand vision that he had, the fact that the Fourth World books only lasted a year is genuinely heartbreaking. Those at DC Comics were frustrated, given that they had hoped that Kirby's arrival would have captured some of Marvel's loyal readers, with Evanier recalling how people within the company believed
he'd stopped being Jack Kirby, the guy who created or co-created so many successful new comics. With the end of his contract in sight, he was Jack Kirby, the guy who did those wonky, unreadable books that didn't sell so great. Jack the Hack, some called him, implying that he'd...
However, while DC were frustrated, Jack Kirby was devastated. After years of feeling disrespected and underappreciated, he finally had his chance to break free and show the world the true extent of his genius, only for it to be snatched away from him once again. Kirby would go on to leave DC in 1975, returning to Marvel for a brief stint that saw him create a spiritual successor to the New Gods in the form of the Eternals. This reunion was short-lived though, and by 1979, Kirby had left the company once again. From then until his 1994 death, Kirby stayed away from mainstream comics, instead working in animation and publishing several creator-owned books, whilst battling with Marvel over the rights to his original pages. Kirby's feelings towards the industry he gave so much for were exemplified in a conversation with James Romberger at a 1980s convention, as Dylan Horrocks explains in the epigraph to his comic Hicksville.
In the 1980s, James Romberger met Kirby at a convention in New York. Kirby kindly looked at Romberger's work and then gave him a piece of advice. "Kid, you're one of the best, but put your work in galleries. Don't do comics. Comics will break your heart."
Jack Kirby was an undisputed legend of the comic book industry. I don't think anyone would argue that. But at this time, many believed that he was never able to achieve his true potential, always confined by editorial decisions and unable to bring his unquestionable genius to life in its purest form. And in a lot of ways, his short-lived Mr. Miracle series best demonstrates this, as it proved to be Kirby's last attempt to truly escape the chains of his past, only to find himself back where he started, always grasping for some way to break free.